The Trial, Franz Kafka, Part 3, Chapter 6. Kay's uncle, Lenny. One afternoon, Kay was very busy at the time getting the post ready. Kay's uncle Carl, a small country landowner, came into the room, pushing his way between two of the staff who were bringing in some papers. Kay had long expected his uncle to appear, but the sight of him now shocked Kay far less than the prospect of it had done a long time ago. Before his uncle was bound to come, Kay had been sure of that for about a month. He already thought at the time he could see how his uncle would arrive. Slightly bowed, his battered Panama hat in his left hand, his right hand already stretched out over the desk long before he was close enough, as he rushed carelessly towards Kay, knocking over everything that was in his way. Kay's uncle was always in a hurry, as he suffered from the unfortunate belief that he had a number of things to do while he was in the big city and had to settle all of them in one day. His visits were only ever for one day, and at the same time thought he could not forgo any conversation or piece of business or pleasure that might arise by chance. Uncle Carl was Kay's former guardian, and so Kay was duty bound to help him in all of this, as well as to offer him a bed for the night. "I'm haunted by a ghost from the country," he would say. As soon as they had greeted each other, Kay had invited him to sit in the armchair, but Uncle Carl had no time for that. He said he wanted to speak briefly with Kay in private. "It is necessary," he said with a tired gulp. "It is necessary for my peace of mind." Kay immediately sent the junior staff from the room and told them to let no one in. "What's this that I've been hearing, Joseph?" cried Kay's uncle when they were alone, as he sat on the table shoving various papers under himself without looking at them to make himself more comfortable. Kay said nothing. He knew what was coming, but suddenly relieved from the effort of the work he had been doing, he gave way to a pleasant lassitude and looked out the window at the other side of the street. From where he sat, he could see just a small triangular section of it, part of the empty walls of houses between two shop windows. "You're staring out the window," called out his uncle, raising his arms. "For God's sake, Joseph, give me an answer. Is it true? Can it really be true?" "Uncle Carl," said Kay, wrenching himself back from his daydreaming, "I really don't know what it is you want of me." "Joseph," said his uncle in a waning tone, "as far as I know, you've always told the truth. Am I to take what you've just said as a bad sign?" "I think I know what it is you want," said Kay obediently. "I expect you've heard about my trial." "That's right," answered his uncle, with a slow nod. "I've heard about your trial." "Who did you hear it from, then?" asked Kay. "Erna wrote to me," said his uncle. "She doesn't have much contact with you, it's true. You don't pay very much attention to her, I'm afraid to say, but she learned about it nonetheless." I got her letter today, and of course I came straight here, and for no other reason, but it seems to me that this is reason enough. I can read you out the part of the letter that concerns you." He drew the letter out from his wallet. "Here it is." She writes, "I have not seen Joseph for a long time. I was in the bank last week, but Joseph was so busy that they would not let me through. I waited there for nearly an hour, but then I had to go home, as I had my piano lesson. I would have liked to have spoken to him. Maybe there will be a chance another time. He sent me a big box of chocolates for my name day. That was very nice and attentive of him. I forgot to tell you about it when I wrote, and I only remember now that you asked me about it. Chocolate, as I am sure you are aware, disappears straight away in this lodging house almost as soon as you know somebody has given you chocolate. It is gone. But there is something else I wanted to tell you about, Joseph. Like I said, they would not let me through to see him at the bank because he was negotiating with some gentleman just then. After I had been waiting quietly for quite a long time, I asked one of the staff whether his meeting would last much longer. He said it might well do, as it was probably about the legal proceedings he said that were being conducted against him. I asked what sort of legal proceedings it was that were being conducted against the chief clerk, and whether he was not making some mistake. But he said he was not making any mistake. There were legal proceedings under way, and even that they were about something quite serious. But he did not know any more about it. He would have liked to have been of some help to the chief clerk himself, as the chief clerk was a gentleman, good and honest, but he did not know what it was he could do, and merely hoped there would be some influential gentleman who would take his side. I am sure that is what will happen, and that everything will turn out for the best in the end. But in the meantime, things do not look good at all, and you can see that from the mood of the chief clerk himself. Of course, I did not place too much importance on this conversation, and even did my best to put the bank clerk's mind at rest. He was quite a simple man. I told him he was not to speak to anyone else about this, and I think it is all just a rumor. But I still think it might be good if you, dear father, if you looked into the matter the next time you visit. It will be easy for you to find out more detail, and if it isn't really necessary to do something about it through the great and influential people you know. But if it is not necessary, and that is what seems most likely, then at least your daughter will soon have the chance to embrace you, and I look forward to it. She's a good child," says Kay's uncle, when he had finished reading, and wiped a few tears from his eyes. Kay nodded. With all the different disruptions he had had recently, he had completely forgotten about Irma. Even her birthday and the story of the chocolates had clearly just been invented so that he wouldn't get in trouble with his aunt and uncle. It was very touching, and even the theater tickets, which he would regularly send her from then on, would not be enough to repay her. But he really did not feel now that it was right for him to visit her in her lodgings and hold conversations with the little 18-year-old schoolgirl. "And what do you have to say about that?" asked his uncle, who had forgotten all his rush and excitement as he read the letter and seemed to be about to read it again. "Yes, uncle," said Kay, is true." "True!" called out his uncle. "What is true? How can this be true? What sort of trial is it? Not a criminal trial, I hope?" "It's a criminal trial," answered Kay, "and you sit here quietly here while you've got a criminal trial round your neck," shouted his uncle, getting even louder. "The more calm I am, the better it will be for the outcome," said Kay in a tired voice. "Don't worry." "How can I help worrying?" shouted his uncle. "Joseph, my dear Joseph, think about yourself, about your family, think about our good name. Up till now, you've always been our pride. Don't now become our disgrace. I don't like the way you're behaving," he said, looking at Kay with his head at an angle. "That's not how an innocent man behaves when he's accused of something, not if he's still got any strength in him. Just tell me what it's all about so that I can help you. It's something to do with the bank, I take it?" "No," said Kay as he stood up. "And you're speaking too loud, uncle. I expect one of the staff is listening at the door, and I find that rather unpleasant. It's best if we go somewhere else. Then I can answer all your questions as far as I can, and I know very well that I have to account to the family for what I do." "You certainly do," his uncle shouted. "Quite right you do. Now just get a move on, Joseph. Hurry up now." "I still have a few documents I need to prepare," said Kay, and using the intercom, he summoned his deputy, who entered a few moments later. Kay's uncle, still angry and excited, gestured with his hand to show that Kay had summoned him, even though there was no need whatsoever to do so. Kay stood in front of the desk and explained to the young man, who listened calm and attentive, what would need to be done that day in his absence. Speaking in a calm voice, and making use of various documents, the presence of Kay's uncle while this was going on was quite disturbing. He did not listen to what was being said, but at first he stood there with his eyes wide open, nervously biting his lips. Then he began to walk up and down the room, stopped now and then at the window, or stood in front of a picture, always making various exclamations, such as, "That is totally incomprehensible to me," or, "Now just tell me, what are you supposed to make of that?" The young man pretended to notice nothing of this and listened to Kay's instructions through to the end. He made a few notes, bowed to both Kay and his uncle, and then left the room. Kay's uncle had turned his back to him and was looking out the window, bunching up the curtains with his outstretched hands. The door had hardly closed when he called out, "At last! Now that he's stopped jumping about, we can go too." Once they were in front of the hall of the bank, where several members of staff were standing about, and where, just then, the deputy director was walking across. There was, unfortunately, no way of stopping Kay's uncle from continually asking questions about the trial. "Now then, Joseph," he began, slightly acknowledging the bows from those around them as they passed, "tell me everything about this trial. What sort of trial is it?" Kay made a few comments, which conveyed little information, even laughed about it, and it was only when they reached the front steps that he explained to his uncle that he had not wanted to talk openly in front of those people. "Quite right," said his uncle, "but now start talking." With his head to one side and smoking his cigar in short, impatient draughts, he listened. "First of all, uncle," said Kay, "it's not a trial like you have in a normal courtroom." "So much the worse," said his uncle. "How's that?" asked Kay, looking at him. "What I mean is, that's for the worst," he repeated. They were standing on the front steps of the bank, as the doorkeeper seemed to be listening to what they were saying. Kay drew his uncle down further, where they were absorbed into the bustle of the street. His uncle took Kay's arm and stopped asking questions with such urgency about the trial. They walked on for a while in silence. "But how did all this come about?" he asked eventually, stopping abruptly enough to startle the people walking behind, who had to avoid walking into him. "Things like this don't come all of a sudden. They start developing a long time beforehand. There must have been warning signs of it. Why didn't you write to me? You know I'd do anything for you. To some extent I am still your guardian, and until today that's something I was proud of. I'll still help you, of course I will. Only now that the trial is already under way, it makes it very difficult. But whatever the best thing now is for you to take a short holiday, staying with us in the country. You've lost weight. I can see that now. The country life will give you strength. That will be good. There's bound to be a lot of hard work ahead of you. But besides that, it'll be a way of getting you away from the court, to some extent. Here, they've got every means of showing the powers at their disposal, and they're automatically bound to use them against you. In the country, they'll either have to delegate authority to different bodies, or just have to try and bother you by letter, telegram, or telephone. And that's bound to weaken the effect. It won't release you from them, but it'll give you room to breathe. "You could forbid me to leave," said Kay, who had been drawn silently into his uncle's way of thinking by what he had been saying. "I didn't think you would do it," said his uncle thoughtfully. "You won't suffer too much loss of power by moving away." Kay grasped his uncle under the arm to prevent him stopping still, and said, "I thought you'd think all this is less important than I do, and now you're taking it so hard." "Joseph," called his uncle, trying to disentangle himself from him, so that he could stop walking, but Kay did not let go. "You've completely changed. You used to be so astute. Are you losing it now? Do you want to lose the trial? Do you realize what that would mean? That would mean you would be simply destroyed, and that everyone you know would be pulled down with you, or at the very least humiliated, disgraced right down to the ground. Joseph, pull yourself together. The way you're so indifferent about it, it's driving me mad. Look at you. I can almost believe that old saying, having a trial like that means losing a trial like that." "My dear uncle," said Kay, "it would do itty good to get excited. It's no good for you to do it, and it'd be no good for me to do it. The case won't be won by getting excited, and please admit that my practical experience counts for something. Just as I have always and still do respect your experience, even when it surprises me. You say that the family will also be affected by this trial. I really can't see how, but that's beside the point, and I'm quite willing to follow your instruction in all of this. Only I don't see any advantage in staying in the country, not even for you, as that would indicate flight and a sense of guilt. And besides, although I am more subject to persecution if I stay in the city, I can also press the matter forward better here. You're right, said his uncle, in a tone that seemed to indicate that they were finally coming closer to each other. I just made this suggestion because as I saw it, if you stay in the city, the case will be put in danger by your indifference to it, and I thought it was better if I did the work for you. But will you push things forward yourself with all your strength? If so, that will naturally be far better. We're agreed then, said Kay. And do you have any suggestions for what I should do next? Well, naturally, I'll have to think about it, said his uncle. You must bear in mind that I've been living in the country for 20 years now, almost without a break. You lose your ability to deal with matters like this. But I do have some important connections with several people who I expect know their way around these things better than I do, and to contact them is a matter of course. Out there in the country, I've been getting out of condition. I'm sure you're already aware of that. It's only at times like this that you notice it yourself. And this affair of yours came largely unexpected, although oddly enough I had expected something of the sort after I'd read Erna's letter, and today when I saw your face I knew it with almost total certainty. But all that is by the by. The important thing now is we have no time to lose. Even while he was still speaking, Kay's uncle had stood on tiptoe to summon a taxi, and now he pulled Kay into the car behind himself as he called out an address to the driver. We're going now to see Dr. Hould, the lawyer, he said. We were at school together. I'm sure you know the name, don't you? No? Oh, well, that's odd. He's got a very good reputation as a defense barrister, and for working with the poor. But I esteem him, especially as someone you can trust. It's all right with me. Whatever you do, said Kay, although he was made uneasy by the rushed and urgent way his uncle was dealing with the matter. It was not very encouraging, as the accused be to taken to a lawyer for poor people. I didn't know, he said, that you could take on a lawyer in matters like this. Well, of course you can, said his uncle. That goes without saying. Why wouldn't you take on a lawyer? And now, so that I am properly instructed in this matter, tell me what's been happening so far. Kay instantly began telling his uncle about what had been happening, holding nothing back. Being completely open with him was the only way that Kay could protest at his uncle's belief that the trial was a great disgrace. He mentioned Miss Bursner's name just once, and in passing, But that did nothing to diminish his openness about the trial, as Miss Bursner had no connection with it. As he spoke, he looked out the window and saw how just then they were getting closer to the suburb where the court offices were. He drew this to his uncle's attention, but he did not find the coincidence especially remarkable. The taxi stopped in front of a dark building. Kay's uncle knocked at the very first door at the ground level. While they waited, he smiled, showing his big teeth, and whispered, 8 o'clock. Not the usual sort of time to be visiting a lawyer, but Hold won't mind it from me. Two large black eyes appeared in the spy hatch in the door. They stared at the two visitors for a while and then disappeared. The door, however, did not open. Kay and his uncle confirmed to each other the fact that they had seen the two eyes. A new maid, afraid of strangers, said Kay's uncles, and knocked again. The eyes appeared once more. This time they seemed almost sad, but the open glass flame that burned with a hiss close above their heads gave off little light, and that may have merely created an illusion. "Open the door," called Kay's uncle, raising his fist against it. "We are friends of Dr. Hould, the lawyer." "Dr. Hould is ill," whispered someone behind them. In a doorway, the far end of the narrow passage, stood a man in his dressing gown, giving them this information in an extremely quiet voice. Kay's uncle, who had already been made very angry by the long wait, turned abruptly round and retorted, "Ill? You say he's ill?" and strode towards the gentleman in a way that seemed almost threatening, as if he were the illness himself. "They've opened the door for you now," said the gentleman, pointing at the door of the lawyer. He pulled his dressing gown together and disappeared. The door had indeed been opened. A young girl, Kay recognized the dark, slightly bulging eyes, stood in the hallway in a long white apron, holding a candle in her hand. "Next time, open up sooner," said Kay's uncle, instead of a greeting, while the girl made a slight curtsy. "Come along, Joseph," he then said to Kay, who was slowly moving over towards the girl. "Dr. Hould is unwell," said the girl, as Kay's uncle, without stopping, rushed towards one of the doors. Kay continued to look at the girl in amazement as she turned round to block the way into the living room. She had a round face, like a puppy's. Not only the pale cheeks and the chin were round, but the temples and the hairline were too. "Joseph!" called his uncle once more, and he asked the girl, "It's trouble with his heart, is it?" "I think it is, sir," said the girl, who by now had found time to go ahead with the candle and open the door into the room. In one corner of the room, where the light of the candle did not reach, a face with a long beard looked up from the bed. "Lenny, who's this comin' in?" asked the lawyer, unable to recognize his guest because he was dazzled by the candle. "It's your old friend, Albert," said Kay's uncle. "Oh, Albert!" said the lawyer, falling back onto his pillow, as if this visit meant he would not need to keep up appearances. "Is it really as bad as that?" asked Kay's uncle, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I don't believe it is. It's a reoccurrence of your heart trouble, and it'll pass like the other times." "Maybe," said the lawyer quietly, "but it's just as much trouble as it's ever been. I can hardly breathe. I can't sleep at all, and I'm getting weaker by the day." "I see," said Kay's uncle, pressing his Panama hat firmly against his knee with his big hand. "That is bad news. But are you getting the right sort of care? And it's so depressing in here. It's so dark. It's a long time since I was last here, but it seemed to me friendlier then. Even your young lady here doesn't seem to have much life in her, unless she's just pretending." The maid was still standing by the door with the candle as far as could be made out. She was watching Kay more than she was watching his uncle, even while the latter was still speaking about her. Kay leant against a chair that he had pushed near to the girl. "When you're as ill as I am," said the lawyer, "you need to have peace. I don't find it depressing." After a short pause he added, "And Linny looks after me well. She's a good girl." But that was not enough to persuade Kay's uncle. He had visibly taken against his friend's carer, and even though he did not contradict the invalid, he persecuted her with his scowl as she went over to the bed, put the candle on the bedside table, and, leaning over the bed, made a fuss of him by tidying the pillows. Kay's uncle nearly forgot the need to show any consideration for the man who lay ill in bed. He stood up, walked up and down behind the carer, and Kay would not have been surprised if he had grabbed hold of her skirts behind her and dragged her away from the bed. Kay himself looked on calmly. He was not even disappointed at finding the lawyer unwell. He had been able to do nothing to impose the enthusiasm his uncle had developed for the matter. He was glad that this enthusiasm had now been distracted without his having to do anything about it. His uncle, probably simply wishing to be offensive to the lawyer's attendant, then said, "Young lady, now please leave us alone for a while. I have some personal matters to discuss with my friend." Dr. Hould's carer was still leant far over the invalid's bed, and smoothing out her cloth covering the wall next to it. She merely turned her head, and then, in striking contrast with the anger that first stopped Kay's uncle from speaking and then let the words out in a gush, she said very quietly, "You can see that Dr. Hould is so ill that he can't discuss any matters at all." It was probably just for the sake of convenience that she had repeated the words spoken by Kay's uncle, but an onlooker might even have perceived it as mocking him, and he, of course, jumped up as if he had just been stabbed. "You damned!" In the first gurgling of his excitement his words could hardly be understood. Kay was startled, even though he had been expecting something of the sort, and ran to his uncle with the intention, no doubt, of closing his mouth with both hands. Fortunately, though, behind the girl, the invalid raised himself up. Kay's uncle made an ugly face as if swallowing something disgusting, and then, somewhat calmer, said, "We have naturally not lost our senses. Not yet. If what I am asking for were not possible, I would not be asking for it. Now please go." The carrier stood up straight by the bed, directly facing Kay's uncle. Kay thought he noticed that with one hand she was stroking the lawyer's hand. "You can say anything in front of Lenny," said the invalid, in a tone that was unmistakably imploring. "It's not my business," said Kay's uncle, "and it's not my secrets." Then he twisted himself round, as if wanting to go into no more negotiations, but giving himself a little more time to think. "Whose business is it, then?" asked the lawyer, in an exhausted voice, as he leant back again. "My nephew's," said Kay's uncle, "and I've brought him along with me." And he introduced himself. "Chief Clerk Joseph Kay." "Oh," said the invalid, now with much more life in him, and reached out his hand towards Kay. "Do forgive me. I didn't notice you there at all." When he then said to his carer, "Lenny, go," stretching his hand out to her as if this were a farewell that would at last have to last for a long time. This time the girl offered no resistance. "So you," he finally said to Kay's uncle, who had also calmed down and stepped closer, "you haven't come to visit me because I'm ill, but you've come on business." The lawyer now looked so much stronger that it seemed the idea of being visited because he was ill had somehow made him weak. He remained supporting himself of one elbow, which must have been rather tiring, and continually pulled at a lock of hair in the middle of his beard. "You already look much better," said Kay's uncle. "Now that that witch has gone outside," he interrupted himself, whispered, "I bet you she's listening," and sprang over to the door, but behind the door there was no one. Kay's uncle came back not disappointed, as her not listening seemed to him worse than if she had been, but probably somewhat embittered. "You're mistaken about her," said the lawyer, but did nothing more to defend her. Perhaps that was his way of indicating that she did not need defending. But in a tone that was much more committed he went on, "As far as your nephew's affairs are concerned, this will be an extremely difficult undertaking, and I'd count myself lucky if my strength lasted out long enough for it. I'm greatly afraid it won't do. But away, I don't want to leave anything untried. If I don't last out, you can always get somebody else. To be honest, this matters interest me too much, and I can't bring myself to give up the chance of taking some part in it. If my heart does totally give out, then at least it will have found a worthy affair to fall in." Kay believed he understood not a word of this entire speech. He looked at his uncle for an explanation, but his uncle sat on the bedside table with the candle in his hand. A medicine bottle had rolled off the table onto the floor. He nodded to everything the lawyer said, agreed to everything, and now and then looked at Kay, urging him to show the same compliance. Maybe Kay's uncle had already told the lawyer about the trial, but that was impossible. Everything that had happened so far spoke against it. So he said, "I don't understand." "Well, maybe I've misunderstood what you've been saying," said the lawyer, just as astonished and embarrassed as Kay. "Perhaps I've been going too fast. What was it you wanted to speak to me about? I thought it was to do with your trial." "Oh, of course it is," said Kay's uncle, who then asked Kay, "So what is it you want?" "Yes, but how is it that you know anything about me and my case?" asked Kay. "Oh, I see," said the lawyer with a smile. "I am a lawyer. I move in court circles. People talk about various different cases, and the more interesting ones stay in your mind, especially when they concern the nephew of a friend. There's nothing very remarkable about that." "What is it you want, then?" asked Kay's uncle once more. "You seem so uneasy about it." "You move in this court's circles?" asked Kay. "Yes," said the lawyer. "You're asking questions like a child," said Kay's uncle. "What circle should I move in, then, if not with members of my own discipline?" The lawyer added. It sounded so indisputable that Kay gave no answer at all. "But you work in the High Court, not that court in the attic," he had wanted to say, but could not bring himself to actually utter it. "You have to realize," the lawyer continued, in a tone as if he were explaining something obvious, unnecessary, and incidental, "you have to realize that I also derive great advantage from my clients for mixing with those people, and do so in many different ways. It's not something you can keep talking about all the time. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage now, of course, because of my illness, but I still get visits from some good friends of mine at the court, and I learn one or two things. It might even be that I learn more than many of those who are in the best of health and spend all day in court. And I'm receiving a very welcome visit right now, for instance." And he pointed into a dark corner of the room. "Where?" asked Kay, almost uncouth in his surprise. He looked round uneasily. The little candle gave off far too little light to reach as far as the wall opposite. And then something did indeed begin to move there in the corner. In the light of the candle held up by Kay's uncle, an elderly gentleman could be seen sitting beside a small table. He had been sitting there for so long without being noticed that he could hardly have been breathing. Now he stood up, with a great deal of fuss, clearly unhappy that attention had been drawn to him. It was as if by flapping his hands about like short wings he hoped to deflect any introductions and greetings, as if he wanted on no account to disturb the others by his presence, and seemed to be exhorting them to leave him back in the dark and forget about his being there. That, however, was something that could no longer be granted to him. "You took us by surprise, you see," said the lawyer in explanation, cheerfully indicating to the gentleman that he should come closer, which slowly, hesitatingly, looking all around him, but with a certain dignity, he did. The office director. Oh, yes, forgive me, I haven't introduced you. This is my friend Albert K. This is his nephew, the chief clerk, Joseph K. And this is the office director. So the office director was kind enough to pay me a visit. It's only possible to appreciate just how valuable a visit like this is if you've been let into the secret of what a pile of work the office director has heaped over him. Well, he came anyway. We were having a peaceful chat, as far as I was able when I'm so weak. And although we hadn't told Lenny she mustn't let anyone in as we weren't expecting anyone, we still would rather have remained alone. But then along came you, Albert, thumping your fist on the door. The office director moved over into the corner, pulling his table and chair with him. But now it turns out we might have, that is, if that's what you wish, we might have something to discuss with each other, and it would be good if we can all come back together again. Office director, he said, with his head on one side, pointing with a humble smile to an armchair near the bed. I'm afraid I'll only be able to stay a few minutes more, smiled the office director as he spread himself out in the chair and looked at the clock. Business calls, but I wouldn't want to miss the chance of meeting a friend of mine here. He inclined his head slightly towards Kay's uncle, who seemed very happy with his new acquaintance, but he was not the sort of person to express his feelings of difference, and responded to the officer director's words with embarrassed but loud laughter. A horrible sight. Kay was able to quietly watch everything as nobody paid any attention to him. The officer director took over as leader of the conversation, as seemed to be his habit once he had been called forward. The lawyer listened attentively, with his hand to his ear, his initial weakness having perhaps only had the function of driving away his new visitors. Kay's uncle served as candle bearer, balancing the candle on his thigh, while the office director frequently glanced nervously at it, and was soon free of his embarrassment, and was quickly enchanted not only by the officer director's speaking manner, but also by the gentle waving hand movements with which he accompanied it. Kay, leaning against the bedpost, was totally ignored by the office director, perhaps deliberately, and served the old man only as audience. And besides, he had hardly any idea what the conversation was about, and his thoughts soon turned to the care assistant and the ill treatment she had suffered from his uncle. Soon after, he began to wonder whether he had not seen the office director somewhere before, perhaps among the people who were at his first hearing. He may have been mistaken, but thought the office director might well have been among the old gentlemen with the thin beards in the first row. There was then a noise that everyone heard from the hallway, as if something of porcelain were being broken. "I'll go and see what's happened," said Kay, who slowly left the room, as if giving the others the chance to stop him. He had hardly stepped into the hallway, finding his bearings in the darkness, with his hand still firmly holding a door, when another small hand, much smaller than Kay's own, placed itself on his and gently shut the door. It was the carer who had been waiting there. "Nothing has happened," she whispered to him. "I just threw a plate against the wall to get you out of there." "I was thinking about you as well," replied Kay uneasily. "So much the better," said the carer. "Come with me." A few steps along they came to a frosted glass door, which the carer opened for him. "Come in here," she said. It was clearly the lawyer's office, fitted out with old, heavy furniture as far as could be seen in the moonlight, which now illuminated just a small rectangular section of the floor by each of the three big windows. "This way," said the carer, pointing to a dark trunk with a carved wooden backrest. When he had sat down, Kay continued to look round the room. It was a large room with a high ceiling. The clients of this lawyer for the poor must have felt quite lost in it. Kay thought he could see the little steps with which visitors would approach the massive desk. But then he forgot about all of this, and had eyes only for their carer, who sat very close behind him, almost pressing him against the armrest. "I did think," she said, "you would come out here to me by yourself, with me having to call you first. It was odd. First you stare at me as soon as you came in, and then you keep me waiting. And you ought to call me Lenny, too," she added quickly and suddenly, as if no moment of this conversation should be lost. "Gladly," said Kay, "but as for its being odd, Lenny, that's easy to explain. Firstly, I had to listen to what the old men were saying and couldn't leave without a good reason. But secondly, I'm not a bold person. If anything, I'm quite shy. And you, Lenny, you didn't really look like you could be won over in one stroke, either." "That's not it," said Lenny, laying one arm on the armrest and looking at Kay. "You didn't like me, and I don't suppose you like me now, either." "Liking wouldn't be very much," said Kay. "Oh!" she exclaimed with a smile, thus making use of Kay's comment to gain advantage over him. So Kay remained silent for a moment. By now he had become used to the darkness in the room, and was able to make out various fixtures and fittings. He was especially impressed by a large picture hanging to the right of the door. He leaned forward in order to see it better. It depicted a man wearing a judge's robes. He was sitting on a lofty throne, gilded in a way that shone forth from the picture. The odd thing about the picture was that this judge was not sitting there in dignified calm, but had his left arm pressed against the back and armrest. His right arm, however, was completely free, and only grasped the armrest with his hand, as if about to jump up any moment in vigorous outrage and make some decisive comment or even to pass sentence. The accused was probably meant to be imagined at the foot of the steps, the top one of which could be seen in the picture covered with a yellow carpet. "That might be my judge," said Kay, pointing to the picture with one finger. "I know him," said Lenny, looking up at the picture. "He comes here quite often. That picture is from when he was young, but he can never have looked anything like it, as he's tiny, minute almost, but despite that he had himself made to look bigger in the picture, as he's madly vain, just like everyone round here. But even I'm vain, and that makes me very unhappy that you don't like me." Kate replied to that last comment merely by embracing Lenny, and drawing her towards him, she lay her head quietly on his shoulder. To the rest of it, though, he said, "What rank is he?" "He's an examining judge," she said, taking hold of the hand with which Kay held her, and playing with his fingers. "Just an examining judge once again," said Kay in disappointment. "The senior officials keep themselves hidden. But here he is sitting on a throne." "That's all just made up," said Lenny, with her face bent over Kay's hand. "Really, he's sitting on a kitchen chair with an old horse blanket folded over it. But do you have to be always thinking about your trial?" she added slowly. "No, not at all," said Kay. "I probably even think too little about it." "That's not the mistake you're making," said Lenny. "You're too unyielding. That's what I've heard." "Who said that?" asked Kay. He felt her body against his chest, and looked down on her rich, dark, tightly bound hair. "I'd be saying too much if I told you that," answered Lenny. "Please don't ask for names, but do stop making these mistakes of yours. Stop being so unyielding. There's nothing you can do to defend yourself from this court. You have to confess. So confess to them as soon as you get the chance. It's only then that they give you the chance to get away. Not till then. Only without help from outside, even that's impossible. But you needn't worry about getting this help, as I want to help you myself. You understand a lot about this court, and what sort of tricks are needed," said Kay, as he lifted her, since she was pressing in much too close to him on his lap. "That's all right, then," she said, and made herself comfortable on his lap by smoothing out her skirt and adjusting her blouse. Then she hung both her arms around his neck, leant back, and took a long look at him. "And what if I don't confess? Could you not help me then?" asked Kay, to test her out. "I'm accumulating women to help me," he thought to himself, almost in amazement. "First Miss Bosner, then the court usher's wife, and now this little care assistant, who seems to have some incomprehensible need for me. The way she sits on my lap as if it were her proper place." "No," answered Linley, slowly shaking her head, "I couldn't help you then. But you don't want my help anyway. It means nothing to you. You're too stubborn and won't be persuaded." Then after a while she asked, "Do you have a lover?" "No," said Kay. "Oh, you must have." "Well, I really just think I even betrayed her while I'm carrying her photograph with me. Lenny insisted he show her a photograph of Elsa, and then, hunched on his lap, studied the picture closely. The photograph was not one that had been taken while Elsa was posing for it. It showed her just after she had been in a wild dance, such as she liked to do in wine bars. Her skirt was still flung out as she spun round. She had placed her hands on her firm hips, and with her neck held taut, looked to one side with a laugh. You could not see from the picture whom her laugh was intended for. She "She's very tightly laced," said Lenny, pointing to the place where she thought she could be seen. "I don't like her. She's clumsy and crude, but maybe she's gentle and friendly towards you. That's the impression you get from the picture. Big strong girls like that often don't know how to be anything but gentle and friendly. Would she be capable of sacrificing herself for you, though?" "No," said Kay. "She isn't gentle or friendly. And now would she be capable of sacrificing herself for me? But I've never yet asked any of those things of her. I've never looked at this picture as closely as you." "You can't think much of her, then? She can't be your lover after all." "Yes, she is," said Kay. "I'm not going to take my word back on that." "Well, she might be your lover now, then," said Lenny, "but you wouldn't miss her much if you lost her. Or if you exchanged her for someone else, me, for instance." "That is certainly conceivable," said Kay, with a smile. "But she does have one major advantage over you. She knows nothing about my trial, and even if she did she wouldn't think about it. She wouldn't try to persuade me to be less unyielding." "Well, that's no advantage," said Lenny. "If she's got no advantage other than that, I can keep on hoping." "Has she got any bodily defects?" "Bodily defects?" asked Kay. "Yeah," said Lenny, "as I do have a bodily defect, just a little one. Look." She spread the middle and ring fingers of her right hand apart from each other. Between those fingers the flap of skin connecting them reached up almost as far as the top joint of the little finger. In the darkness Kay did not see at first what it was she was wanting to show him, so she led his hand to it so that he could feel. "What a freak of nature!" said Kay, and when he had taken a look at the whole hand he added, "What a pretty claw!" Lenny looked on with a kind of pride, as Kay repeatedly opened and closed her two fingers in amazement, until finally he briefly kissed them and let go. "Oh!" she immediately exclaimed, "you kissed me!" Hurriedly, and with her mouth open, she clambered up Kay's lap with her knees. He was almost aghast as he looked up at her. Now that she was so close to him, there was a bitter, irritating smell from her like pepper. She grasped his head, leant out over him, and bit and kissed his neck, even biting into his hair. "I've taken her place," she exclaimed from time to time. "Just look, now you've taken me inside of her." Just then her knee slipped out, and with a little cry she nearly fell down onto the carpet. Kay tried to hold her by putting his arm around her, and was pulled down with her. "Now you're mine," said she. Her last words to him as he left were, "Here's the key to the door. Come whenever you want." As she planted an undirected kiss on his back when he stepped out the front door, there was a light rain falling. He was about to go to the middle of the street to see if he could still glimpse Lenny at the window when Kay's uncle leapt out of a car that Kay, thinking of other things, had not seen waiting outside the building. He took hold of Kay by both arms and shoved him against the door as if he wanted to nail him to it. "Young man," he shouted, "how could you do a thing like that? Things were going well with this business of yours. Now you've caused it terrible damage. You slope off with some dirty little thing who, moreover, is obviously the lawyer's beloved, and stay away for hours. You don't even try to find an excuse. Don't try to hide anything. No, you're quite open about it. You run off with her and stay there. And meanwhile we're sitting there, your uncle who's going to such effort for you, the lawyer who needs to be won over to your side, and above all the office director, a very important gentleman who is in direct command of your affair in its present stage. We wanted to discuss how best to help you. I had to handle the lawyer very carefully. He had to handle the officer director carefully. And you had most reason of all to at least give me some support. Instead of which you stay away. Eventually we couldn't keep up the pretense any longer, but these are polite and highly capable men. They didn't say anything about it, so as to spare my feelings, but in the end not even they could continue to force themselves, and as they couldn't speak about the matter in hand, they became silent. We sat there for several minutes, listening to whether you wouldn't finally come back, all in vain. In the end the office director stood up, as he had stayed far longer than he had originally intended, made his farewell, looked at me in sympathy without being able to help. He waited at the door for a long time, although it's more than I can understand why he was being so good, and then he went. I, of course, was glad he'd gone. I'd been holding my breath all this time. All this had even a more effect on the lawyer lying there ill. When I took my leave of him, the good man, he was quite unable to speak. You have probably contributed to his total collapse, and so brought the very man who you are dependent on closer to his death. And me, your own uncle, you leave me here in the rain. Just feel this. I'm wet right through, waiting here for hours, sick with worry. Chapter 7. Lawyer, manufacturer, painter. One winter morning, snow was falling in the dull light outside. Kay was sitting in his office, already extremely tired despite the early hour. He had told the servitor he was engaged in a major piece of work, and none of the junior staff should be allowed in to see him, so he would not be disturbed by them at least. But instead of working, he turned round in his chair, slowly moved various items around his desk, but then, without being aware of it, he lay his arm stretched out on the desktop, and sat there immobile with his head sunk down on his chest. He was no longer able to get through the thought of the trial out of his head. He had often wondered whether it might not be a good idea to work out a written defense and hand it in to the court. It would contain a short description of his life, and explain why he had acted the way he had at each event that was in any way important. Whether he now considered he had acted well or ill, and his reason for each. There was no doubt of the advantages a written defense of this sort would have over relying on the lawyer, who was anyway, notwithstanding his shortcomings. Kay had no idea what actions the lawyer was taking. It was certainly not a lot. It was more than a month since the lawyer had summoned him, and none of the previous discussions had given Kay the impression that this man would be able to do much for him. Most importantly, he had asked him hardly any questions, and there were so many questions here to be asked. Asking questions were the most important thing. Kay had the feeling that he would be able to ask all the questions needed here himself. The lawyer, in contrast, did not ask questions, but did all the talking himself, or sat silently facing him, leant forward slightly over the desk, probably because he was hard of hearing, pulled on a strand of hair in the middle of his beard, and looked down at the carpet, perhaps at the very spot where Kay had lain with Lenny. Now and then he would give Kay some vague warning of the sort you give to children. His speeches were as pointless as they were boring, and Kay decided that when the final bill came, he would pay not a penny for them. Once the lawyer thought he had humiliated Kay sufficiently, he usually started something that would raise his spirits again. He had already, he would then say, won many such cases, partly or in whole cases which may not really have been as difficult as this one, but which, on the face of it, had even less hope of success. He had a list of these cases here in the drawer. Here he would tap on one or other of the drawers in his desk, but could unfortunately not show them to Kay, as they dealt with official secrets. Nonetheless, the great experience he had acquired through all these cases would, of course, be of benefit to Kay. He had, of course, begun work straight away, and was nearly ready to submit the first documents. They would be very important, because the first impression made by the defense will often determine the whole course of the proceedings. Unfortunately, though, he would still have to make it clear to Kay that the first documents submitted are sometimes not even read by the court. They simply put them with the other documents and point out that, for the time being, questioning and observing the accused are much more important than anything written. If the applicant becomes insistent, then they add that before they come to any decision, as soon as all the material has been brought together, with due regard, of course, to all the documents, then these first documents to have been submitted will also be checked over. But unfortunately, even this is not usually true. The first documents submitted are usually mislaid or completely, and even if they do keep them right to the end, they are hardly read, although the lawyer only knew about this from rumor. This is all very regrettable, but not entirely without its justifications. But Kay should not forget that the trial would not be public. If the court deemed it necessary, it can be made public, but there is no law that says it has to be. As soon the accused and his defense don't have access even to the court records, and especially not to the indictment. And that means we generally don't know, or at least not precisely, what the first documents need to be about. Which means that if they do contain anything of relevance to the case, it only by a lucky coincidence. If anything about the individual charges and the reasons for them come out clearly or can be guessed at while the accused is being questioned, then it's possible to work out and submit documents that really direct the issue and present proof, but not before. Conditions like this, of course, place the defense in a very unfavorable and difficult position. But that is what they intend. In fact, defense is not really allowed under the law. It's only tolerated, and there is even some dispute about whether the relevant parts of the law imply even that. So strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a counsel acknowledged by the court, and anyone who comes before this court as counsel is basically no more than a barrack room lawyer. The effect of all of this, of course, is to remove the dignity of the whole procedure. The next time Kay is in the court offices, he might like to have a look in at the lawyer's room, just so that he's seen it. He might well be quite shocked by the people he sees assembled there. The room they've been allocated, with its narrow space and low ceilings, will be enough to show what contempt the court has for these people. The only light in the room comes through a little window that is so high up that, if you want to look out of it, you first have to get one of your colleagues to support you on his back. And even then the smoke from the chimney just in front of it will go up your nose and make your face black. In the floor of this room, to give yet another example of the conditions there is a hole that's been there for more than a year. It's not so big that a man could fall through, but it is big enough for your foot to disappear through it. The lawyer's room is on the second floor of the attic. If your foot does go through, it will hang down into the first floor of the attic underneath it, and right in the corridor where the litigants are waiting. It's no exaggeration when lawyers say that conditions like that are a disgrace. Complaints to the management don't have the slightest effect, but the lawyers are strictly forbidden to alter anything in the room at their own expense. But even treating the lawyers in this way has its reasons. They won't, as far as possible, to prevent any kind of defense. Everything should be made the responsibility of the accused. No, a bad point of view, basically. But nothing could be more mistaken than to think that the lawyers are not necessary for the accused in the court. On the contrary, there is no court where they are less needed than here. This is because proceedings are generally kept secret, not only from the public, but also from the accused. Only as far as that is possible, of course, but it is possible to a very large extent. And the accused doesn't get to see the court records either, and it's very difficult to infer what's in the court records from what's been said during questioning based on them, especially for the accused, who is in a difficult situation and is faced with every possible worry to distract him. This is when the defense begins. Counsel for the defense are not normally allowed to be present while the accused is being questioned, so afterwards, and if possible, still at the door of the interview room, he has to learn what he can about it from him and extract whatever he can that might be of use, even though what the accused has to report is often very confused. But that is not the most important thing, as there's really not a lot that can be learned in this way, although in this, as with anything else, a competent man will learn more than another. Nonetheless, the most important thing is the lawyer's personal connection. That's where the real value of taking counsel lies. Now Kay, with most likely have already learned from his own experience that, among its very lowest orders, the court organization does have its imperfections. The court is strictly closed to the public, but staff who forget their duty or who take bribes do, to some extent, show where the gaps are. This is where most lawyers will push their way in. This is where bribes are paid and information extracted. There have even, in earlier times at least, been incidents where documents have been stolen. There's no denying that some surprisingly favorable results have been attained for the accused in this way for a limited time, and these petty advocates then strut to and fro on the basis of them and attract new clients. But for the further course of the proceedings, it signifies either nothing or nothing good. The only thing of real value are honest personal contacts, contacts with higher officials, albeit higher officials of the lower grades, you understand. That is the only way the progress of the trial can be influenced. Hardly noticeable at first, it's true, but from then on it becomes more and more visible. There are, of course, not many lawyers who can do this, and Kay has made a very good choice in this matter. There were probably no more than one or two who had as many contacts as Dr. Hold, but they don't bother with the company of the lawyer's room and have nothing to do with it. This means they have all the less contact with the court officials. It is not at all necessary for Dr. Hould to go to the court, wait in the anterooms for the examining judges to turn up. If they turn up and try to achieve something which, according to the judge's mood, is usually more apparent than real, and most often not even that. No, Kay has seen for himself that the court officials, including some who are quite high up, come forward without being asked, are glad to give information which is fully open or at least easy to understand. They discuss the next stages in the proceedings. In fact, in some cases, they can be won over and are quite willing to adopt the other person's point of view. However, when this happens, you should never trust them too far, as However firmly they may have declared this new point of view in favor of the defendant, they might well go straight back to their offices and write a report for the court that says just the opposite, and might well be even harder on the defendant than the original view, the one they insist they've been fully dissuaded from. Then, of course, there's no way of defending yourself from this. Something said in private is indeed in private, and cannot then be used in public. It's not something that makes it easy for the defense to keep those gentlemen's favor. On the other hand, it's also true that the gentlemen don't become involved with the defense, which will, of course, be done with great expertise, just for philanthropic reasons, or in order to be friendly. In some respects, it would be truer to say that they, too, have it allocated to them. This is where the disadvantages of a court structure that, right from the start, stipulates that all proceedings take place in private, come into force. In normal, mediocre trials, its officials have contact with the public, and they're very well equipped for it. But here they don't. Normal trials run their course all by themselves almost, and just need a nudge here and there. But when they're faced with the cases that are especially difficult, they're as lost as they often are with ones that are very simple. They're forced to spend all their time, day and night, with their laws, and so they don't have the right feel for human relationships, and that's a serious shortcoming in cases like this. That's when they come for advice to the lawyer, with a servant behind them carrying the documents, which normally are kept so secret. You could have seen many gentlemen at this window, gentlemen of whom you would at least expect it, staring out this window in despair on the street below, while the lawyer is at his desk studying the documents so that he can give them good advice. And at times like that, it's also possible to see how exceptionally seriously these gentlemen take their professions, and how they are thrown into great confusion by difficulties which it's just not in their natures to overcome. But they're not in an easy position to regard their position as easy, and would be to do them an injustice. The different ranks and hierarchies of the court are endless, and even someone who knows his way around them cannot always tell what's going to happen. But even for the junior officials, the proceedings in the courtrooms are usually kept secret, so they are hardly able to see how the cases they work with proceed. Court affairs appear in their range of vision, often without their knowing where they come from, and they move on further without their learning where they go. So civil servants like this are not able to learn the things you can learn from studying the successive stages that individual trials go through. The first final verdict, or the reason for it, they're only allowed to deal with that part of the trial which the law allocates them, and they usually know less about the results of their work after it's left them than the defense does, even though the defense will usually stay in contact with the accused until the trial is nearly at its end, so that the court official can learn many useful things from the defense. Bearing all this in mind, does it still surprise Kay that the officials are irritated and often express themselves about the litigants in unflattering ways, which is an experience shared by everyone? All the officials are irritated, even when they appear calm. This causes many difficulties for the junior advocates, of course. There is a story, for instance, that has very much the ring of truth about it. It goes like this. One of the older officials, a good and peaceful man, was dealing with a difficult matter for the court, which had become very confused, especially thanks to the contributions from the lawyers. He had been studying it for a day and a night without a break. As these officials are indeed hard working, no one worked as hard as they do. When it was nearly morning, and he had been working for 24 hours with probably very little result, he went to the front entrance, waited there in ambush, and every time a lawyer tried to enter the building, he would throw him down the steps. The lawyers gathered together down in front of the steps and discussed with each other what they should do. On the one hand, they had actually no right to be allowed into the building, so that there was hardly anything that they could legally do to the official, and, as I've already mentioned, they would have to be careful not to set all the officials against them. On the other hand, any day not spent in court is a day lost for them, and it was a matter of some importance to force their way inside. In the end, they agreed that they would try to tire out the old man. One lawyer after another was sent up to run up the steps and let himself be thrown down again, offering what resistance he could as long as it was passive resistance and his colleagues would catch him at the bottom of the steps. That went on for about an hour until the old gentleman, who was already exhausted from working all night, was very tired and went back to his office. Those who were at the bottom of the steps could not believe it at first, so they sent somebody out to go and look behind the door to see if there really was no one there, and only then did they all gather together, and probably didn't even dare to complain, as it's far from being the lawyer's job to introduce any improvements in our court system, or even to want to. Even the most junior lawyer can understand the relationship there to some extent. But one significant point is that almost every defendant, even very simple people, begins to think of suggestions for improving the court as soon as proceedings have begun. Many of them often even spend time and energy on the matter that could be spent far better elsewhere. The only right thing to do is to learn how to deal with the situation as it is. Even if it were possible to improve any detail of it, which is anyway no more than superstitious nonsense, the best that they could achieve, although doing themselves incalculable harm in the process, is that they will have attracted the special attention of the officials for any case that comes up in the future, and the officials are always ready to seek revenge. Never attract attention to yourself. Stay calm. however much it goes against your character. Try to gain some insight into the size of the court organism and how, to some extent, it remains in a state of suspension, and that even if you alter something in one place, you'll draw the ground out from under your feet and might fall. Whereas if an enormous organism like the court is disrupted in any one place, it finds it easy to provide a substitute for itself somewhere else. Everything is connected with everything else and will continue without any change, or else, which is quite probable, even more closed, more attentive, more strict, more malevolent. So it's best to leave the work to the lawyers and not to keep disturbing them. It doesn't do much good to make accusations, especially if you can't make it clear what they're based on and their full significance. But it must be said that Kay caused a great deal of harm to his own case by his behavior towards the office director. He was a very influential man, but now he might as well be struck off the list of those who might do anything for Kay. If the trial is mentioned, even just in passing, it's quite obvious that he's ignoring it. These officials are in many ways just like children, often something quite harmless, although Kay's behavior could unfortunately not be called harmless, will leave them feeling so offended that they will even stop talking with good friends of theirs. They turn away when they see them and do everything they can to oppose them. But then, with no particular reason, surprisingly enough, some little joke that was only ever attempted because everything seems so hopeless will make them laugh, and they'll be reconciled. It's both difficult and hard at the same time to deal with them, and there's hardly any reason for it. It's sometimes quite astonishing that a single, average life is enough to encompass so much that it's at all possible ever to have any success in one's work here. On the other hand, there are also dark moments, such as everyone has, when you think you've achieved nothing at all, when it seems that the only trial to come to a good end are those that were determined to have a good end from the start, and would do so without any help, while all the others are lost, despite all the running to and fro, all the effort, all the little apparent successes that gave such joy. Then you no longer feel very sure of anything, and if asked about a trial that was doing well by its own nature, but which was turned for the worst because you assisted in it, would not even dare deny that. And even that is a kind of self-confidence, but that it's the only one that's left. Lawyers are especially vulnerable to fits of depression of that sort, and they are no more than fits of depression, of course. When a case is suddenly taken out of their hands after they've been conducted, it's so satisfactory for some time. That's probably the worst that can happen to a lawyer. It's not that the accused takes the case away from him. That hardly ever happens. Once a defendant has taken on a certain lawyer, he has to stay with him whatever happens. How could he ever carry on by himself after he's taken on help from a lawyer? No, that just doesn't happen. But what does sometimes happen is that the trial takes on a course where the lawyer may not go along with it. Client and trial are both simply taken away from the lawyer, and then even contact with the court officials won't help, however good they are, as they don't know anything themselves. The trial will have entered a stage where no more help can be given, where it's being processed in courts to which no one has any access, where the defendant cannot even be contacted by his lawyer. You come home one day and find all the documents you've submitted, which you've worked hard to create, and which you had the best hopes for, lying on the desk. They've been sent back, as they can't be carried through to the next stage in the trial. They're just worthless scraps of paper. It doesn't mean that the case has been lost. Not at all. Or, at least, there is no decisive reason for supposing so. It's just that you don't know anything more about the case, and won't be told anything of what's happening. Well, cases like that are the exception, I'm glad to say, and even if case trial is one of them, it's still, for the time being, a long way off. But there was still plenty of opportunity for the lawyers to get to work, and Kay could be sure they would be made of use of. As he had been said, the time for submitting documents was still in the future, and there was no rush to prepare them. It was much more important to start the initial discussions with the appropriate officials, and they had already taken place, with varying degrees of success, it must be said. It was much better not to give away any details before their time, as in that way Kay could only be influenced unfavorably, and his hopes might be raised, or he might be made too anxious. Better just say that some individuals have spoken very favorably, and shown themselves very willing to help, although others have spoken less favorably, but even they have not in any way refused to help. So all in all, the results are very encouraging, only you should certainly not draw any particular conclusions, as all preliminary proceedings begin in the same way, and it was only the way they developed further that would show what the value of these preliminary proceedings have been. Anyway, nothing has been lost yet, and if we can succeed in getting the officer director, despite everything, on our side, and several actions have been undertaken to this end, then everything is a clean wound, as a surgeon would say, and we can wait for the results with some comfort. When he started talking on in this way, the lawyer was quite tireless. He went through it all again every time Kay went to see him. There was always some progress, but he could never be told what sort of progress it was. The first set of documents to be submitted were being worked on, but still not ready, which usually turned out to be a great advantage the next time Kay went to see him, as the earlier occasion would have been a very bad time to put them in, which they could not then have known. If Kay, stupefied from all this talking, ever pointed out that, even considering all these difficulties, progress was very slow, the lawyer would object that progress was not slow at all, but that they might have progressed far further if Kay had come to him at the right time. But he had come to him late, and the lateness would bring still further difficulties, and not only where time was concerned. The only welcome interruption during these visits was always when Lenny contrived to bring the lawyer his tea while Kay was there. Then she would stand behind Kay, pretending to watch the lawyer as he bent greedily over his cup, poured the tea in and drank, and secretly let Kay hold her hand. There was always complete silence. The lawyer drank, Kay squeezed Lenny's hand, and Lenny would sometimes dare to gently stroke Kay's hair. "Still here, are you?" the lawyer would ask when he was ready. "I wanted to take the dishes away," said Lenny. They would give each other's hand a final squeeze. The lawyer would wipe his mouth, and then start talking at Kay again with renewed energy. Was the lawyer trying to comfort Kay or to confuse him? Kay could not tell, but it seemed clear to him that his defense was not in good hands. Maybe everything the lawyer said was quite right, even though he obviously wanted to make himself as conspicuous as possible, and probably had never even taken on a case as important as he said Kay's was. But it was still suspicious how he continually mentioned his personal contacts with the civil servants. Were they to be exploited solely for Kay's benefit? The lawyer never forgot to mention that they were dealing only with junior officials, which meant officials who were dependent on others, and the direction taken in each trial could be important for their own furtherment. Could it be that they were making use of the lawyer to turn trials in a certain direction, which would of course always be at the cost of the defendant? It certain did not mean that they would do that in every trial. That was not likely at all, and there were probably also trials where they gave the lawyer advantages and all the room he needed to turn it in the direction he wanted, as it would also be to their advantage to keep his reputation intact. If that really was their relationship, how would they direct Kay's trial, which, as the lawyer had explained, was especially difficult and therefore important enough to attract great attention from the very first time it came to court? There could not be much doubt about what they would do. The first signs of it could already be seen in the fact that the first documents still had not been submitted, even though the trial had already lasted several months, and that, according to the lawyer, everything was still in its initial stages, which was very effective, of course, in making the defendant passive and keeping him helpless. Then he could be suddenly surprised with the verdict, or at least with a notation that the hearing had not decided in his favor, and the matter would be passed on to a higher office. It was essential that Kay take a hand in it himself. On winter's mornings, such as this, when he was very tired and everything dragged itself lethargically through his head, this belief of his seemed irrefutable. He no longer felt the contempt for the trial that he had had earlier. If he had been alone in the world, it would have been easy for him to ignore it, although it was also certain that in that case the trial would never have arisen in the first place. But now his uncle had already dragged him to see the lawyer. He had to take account of his family. His job was no longer totally separate from the progress of the trial. He himself had carelessly, with a certain inexplicable complacency, mentioned it to acquaintances, and others had learned about it in ways he did not know. His relationship with Miss Bursner seemed to be in trouble because of it. In short, he no longer had any choice whether he would accept the trial or turn it down. He was in the middle of it, and had to defend himself. If he was tired, then that was bad. But there was no reason to worry too much before he needed to. he had been capable of working himself up to his high position in the bank in a relatively short time, and to retain it with respect from everyone. Now he simply had to apply some of the talents that had made that possible for him to the trial. And there was no doubt that it had to turn out well. The most important thing, if something was to be achieved, was to reject in advance any idea that he might be in any way guilty. There was no guilt. The trial was nothing but a piece of business, just like he had already concluded to the benefit of the bank many times. A piece of business that concealed many lurking dangers waiting in ambush for him, as they usually did, and these dangers would need to be defended against. If that was to be achieved, then he must not entertain any idea of guilt. Whatever he did, he would need to look after his own interest as closely as he could. Seen in this way, there was no choice but to take his representation away from the lawyer very soon, at best that evening. The lawyer had told him, as he talked to him, that that was something unheard of, and would probably do him a great deal of harm. But Kay could not tolerate any impediment to his efforts where his trial was concerned. And these impediments were probably caused by the lawyer himself. But once he had shaken off the lawyer, the documents would need to be submitted straight away, and if possible, he would need to see to it that they were being dealt with every day. It would, of course, not be enough, if that was to be done, for Kay to sit in the corridor with his hat under the bench like the others. Day after day, he himself, or one of the women, or somebody else on his behalf, would have to run after the officials and force them to sit at their desks and study Kay's documents instead of looking out of the corridor through the grating. There could be no let-up in these efforts. Everything would need to be organized and supervised. It was about time that the court came up against a defendant who knew how to defend and make use of his rights. But when Kay had the confidence to try and do all this, the difficulty of composing the documents was too much for him. Earlier, just a week or so before, he could only have felt shame at the thought of being made to write out such documents himself. It had never entered his head that the task could also be difficult. He remembered one morning when, already piled up with work, he suddenly shoved everything to one side and took a pad of paper on which he sketched out some of his thoughts on how documents of this sort should proceed. Perhaps he would offer them to that slow-witted lawyer. But just then the door of the manager's office opened, and the deputy director entered the room with a loud laugh. Kay was very embarrassed, although the deputy director, of course, was not laughing at Kay's documents, which he knew nothing about, but at a joke he had just heard about the stock exchange. A joke which needed an illustration if it was to be understood, and now the deputy director leant over Kay's desk, took his pencil from his hand, and drew the illustration on the writing pad that Kay had intended for his ideas about his case. Kay now had no more thoughts of shame. The documents had to be prepared and submitted. If, as was very likely, he could find no time to do it in the office, he would have to do it at home at night. If the nights weren't enough, he would have to take a holiday. Above, he could not stop halfway. That was nonsense, not only in business, but always and everywhere. Needless to say, the documents would mean an almost endless amount of work. It was easy to come to the belief, not only for those of an anxious disposition, that it was impossible ever to finish it. This was not because of laziness or deceit, which were the only things that might have hindered the lawyer in preparing it, but because he did not know what the charge was, or even what consequences it might bring, so that he had to remember every tiny action and event from the whole of his life, looking at them from all sides and checking and reconsidering them. It was also a very disheartening job. It would have been more suitable as a way of passing the long days after he had retired and become senile. But now, just when Kay needed to apply all his thoughts to his work, when he was still rising and already posed a threat to the deputy director, when every hour passed so quickly and he wanted to enjoy the brief evenings and nights as a young man, this was the time he had to start working out these documents. Once more he began to feel resentment, almost involuntary, only to put an end to it. His finger felt for the button of the electric bell in the anteroom. As he pressed it, he glanced up to the clock. It was 11 o'clock. 2 hours. He had spent a great deal of his costly time just dreaming, and his wits were, of course, even more dulled than they had been before. But the time had none the less not been wasted. He had come to some decisions that could be of value, as well as various pieces of mail. The servitor brought 2 visiting cards from gentlemen who had already been waiting for Kay some time. They were actually very important clients of the bank who should not really have been kept waiting under the circumstances. Why had they come at such an awkward time? And why the gentleman on the other side of the closed doors seemed to be asking? Was the industrious K using up the best business time for his private affairs? Tired from what had gone before, and tired in anticipation of what was to follow, Kay stood up to receive the first of them. He was a short, jolly man, a manufacturer who Kay knew well. He apologized for disturbing Kay at some important work, and Kay, for his part, apologized for having kept the manufacturer waiting for so long. But even this apology was spoken in such a mechanical way and with such false intonation that the manufacturer would certainly have noticed if he had not been fully preoccupied with his business affairs. Instead, he hurriedly pulled calculations and tables out from all his pockets, spread them out in front of Kay, explained several items, corrected a little mistake in the arithmetic that he noticed as he quickly glanced over it all, and reminded Kay of a similar piece of business he concluded with him about a year before, mentioning in passing that this time there was another bank spending great effort to get his business, and finally stopped speaking in order to learn Kay's opinion on the matter. And Kay had indeed at first been closely following what the manufacturer was saying. He too was aware of how important the deal was, but unfortunately it did not last. He soon stopped listening, nodded at each of the manufacturer's loud exclamations, for a short while, but eventually he stopped doing that, and did no more than stare at the bald head bent over the papers, asking himself when the manufacturer would finally realize that everything he was saying was useless. When he did stop talking, Kay really thought at first that this was so that he would have the chance to confess he was incapable of listening. Instead, seeing the anticipation of the manufacturer's face, obviously ready to counter any objections made, he was sorry to realize that the business discussion had to be continued. So he bent his head as if he'd been given an order, and began slowly to move his pencil over the papers. Now and then he would stop and stare at one of the figures. The manufacturer thought there must be some objection. Perhaps his figures weren't really sound. Perhaps they weren't the decisive issue. Whatever he thought, the manufacturer covered the papers with his hand, and began once again moving very closely to Kay to explain what the deal was all about. "It is difficult," said Kay, pursing his lips. The only thing that could offer him any guidance were the papers, and the manufacturer had covered them from his view. So he just sank back against the arm of the chair. Even when the door of the manager's office opened and revealed not very clearly, as if through a veil, the deputy director, he did no more than look up weakly. Kay thought no more about the matter. He merely watched the immediate effect of the deputy director's appearance, and for him the effect was very pleasing. The manufacturer immediately jumped up from his seat and hurried over to meet the deputy director, although Kay would have liked to make him 10 times livelier, as he feared the deputy director might disappear again. He needed not have worried. The two gentlemen met each other, shook each other's hand, and went together over to Kay's desk. The manufacturer said he was sorry to find the chief clerk so little inclined to do business, pointing to Kay, who, under the view of the deputy director, had bent back down over the papers. As the two men leant over the desk and the manufacturer made some effort to gain and keep the deputy director's attention, Kay felt as if they were much bigger than they really were, and that their negotiations were about him. Carefully and slowly turning his eyes upwards, he tried to learn what was taking place above him, took one of the papers from his desk without looking to see what it was, laid it on the flat of his hand, and raised it slowly up as he rose up to the level of the two men himself. He had no particular plan in mind as he did this, but merely felt this was how he would act if only he had finished preparing that great document that was to remove his burden entirely. The deputy director had been paying all his attention to the conversation, and did no more than glance at the paper. He did not read what was written on it at all, as what was important for the chief clerk was not important for him. He took it from Kay's hand, saying, "Thank you, I'm already familiar with everything," and lay it calmly back on the desk. Kay gave him a bitter, sideways look, but the deputy director did not notice this at all. Or if he did notice it, it only raised his spirits. He frequently laughed out loud. One time he clearly embarrassed the manufacturer when he raised an objection in a witty way, but drew him immediately back out of his embarrassment by commenting adversely on himself, and finally invited him into his office where they could bring the matter to its conclusion. "It's a very important matter," said the manufacturer. "I understand that completely, and I am sure the chief clerk—" Even as he said this, he was actually speaking only to the manufacturer— "will be very glad to have us take it off his hands." This is something that needs calm consideration. But he seems to be overburdened today. There are even some people in the room outside who've been waiting there for hours for him." Kay still had enough control of himself to turn away from the deputy director and direct his friendly, albeit stiff smile only at the manufacturer. He had made no other retaliation, bent down slightly, and supported himself with both hands on his desk like a clerk, and watched as the two gentlemen, still talking, took the papers from his desk and disappeared into the manager's office. In the doorway the manufacturer turned and said he wouldn't make his farewell with Kay just yet. He would, of course, let the chief clerk know about the success of his discussion, but he had also had a little something to tell him about. At last Kay was by himself. It did not enter his head to show anyone else into his office, and only became vaguely aware of how nice it was that the people outside thought he was still negotiating with the manufacturer, and for this reason he could not let anyone in to see him, not even the servitor. He went over to the window, sat down on the ledge beside it, held firmly onto the handle, and looked down onto the square outside. The snow was still falling, the weather still had not brightened up at all. He remained a long time sitting in this way, not knowing what it actually was to make him so anxious. Only occasionally did he glance slightly startled over his shoulder at the door to the outer room, where mistakenly he thought he'd heard some noise. No one came, and that made him feel calmer. He went over to the washstand, rinsed his face with cold water, and his head somewhat clearer, went back to his place by the window. The decision to take his defense into his own hands now seemed more of a burden than he had originally assumed. All the while he had left his defense up to the lawyer. His trial had had little basic effect on him. He had observed it from afar as something that was scarcely able to reach him directly. When it suited him, he looked to see how things stood, but he was also able to draw his head back again whenever he wanted. Now, in contrast, if he was to conduct his defense himself, he would have to devote himself entirely to the court. For the time being, at least, successful would mean later on his complete and conclusive liberation. But if he was to achieve this, he would have to place himself, to start with, in far greater danger than he had been in so far. If he ever felt tempted to doubt this, then his experience with the deputy director and the manufacturer that day would be quite enough to convince him of it. How could he have sat there totally convinced of the need to do this home defense? How would it be later? What would his life be like in the days ahead? Would he find the way through it all to a happy conclusion? Did a carefully worked out defense and any other sort would have made no sense? Did a carefully worked out defense not also mean he would need to shut himself off from everything else as much as he could? Would he survive that? And how was he to succeed in conducting all this at the bank? It involved much more than just submitting some documents that he could probably prepare in a few days' leave, although it would have been great temerity to ask for time off from the bank just at that time. It was a whole trial. There was no way of seeing how long it might last. This was an enormously difficult that had suddenly been thrown into Kay's life. And was he supposed to be doing the bank's work at a time like this? He looked down at his desk. Was he supposed to let people in to see him and go into negotiations with them at a time like this? While his trial trundled on, while the court officials upstairs in the attic room, sat looking at the papers for his trial. Should he be worrying about the business of the bank? Did this not seem like a kind of torture, acknowledged by the court, connected with the trial, and which followed him around? And is it likely that anyone in the bank, when judging his work, would take any account of his peculiar situation? No one, and never. There were those who knew about his trial, although it was not quite clear who knew about it or how much. But he hoped rumors had not reached as far as the deputy director, otherwise he would obviously soon find a way of making use of it to harm Kay. He would show neither comradeship nor humanness. And what about the director? It was true that he was well disposed towards Kay, and as soon as he heard about the trial, he would probably try to do everything he could to make it easier for him. But he would certainly not devote himself to it. Kay, at one time, had provided the counterbalance to what the deputy director said, but the deputy director was now coming more and more under his influence, and the deputy director would also exploit the weakened condition of the director to strengthen his own power. So what could Kay hope for? Maybe considerations of this sort weakened his power of resistance, but it was still necessary not to deceive oneself and to see everything as clearly as it could be seen in that moment. For no particular reason, just to avoiding returning to his desk for a while, he opened the window. It was difficult to open, and he had to turn the handle with both his hands. Then, through the whole height and breadth of the window, the mixture of fog and smoke was drawn into the room, filling it with a slight smell of burning. A few flakes of snow were blown in with it. "It's a horrible autumn," said the manufacturer, who had come into the room unnoticed after seeing the deputy director, and now stood behind Kay. Kay nodded and looked uneasily at the manufacturer's briefcase, from which he would now probably take the papers and inform Kay of the result of his negotiations with the deputy director. However, the manufacturer saw where Kay was looking, knocked on his briefcase, and without opening it said, "You'll be wanting to hear how things turned out. I've already got the contract in my pocket almost. He's a charming man, your deputy director. He's got his dangers, though." He laughed as he shook Kay's hand and wanted to make him laugh with him. But to Kay it once more seemed suspicious that the manufacturer did not want to show him the papers and saw nothing about his comments to laugh at. "Chief clerk," said the manufacturer, "I expect the weather's been affecting your mood, has it? You're looking so worried today." "Yes," said Kay, raising his hand and holding the temple of his head. "Headaches, worries in the family." "Quite right," said the manufacturer, who was always in a hurry and could never listen to anyone for very long. "Everyone has his cross to bear." Kay had unconsciously made a step towards the door, as if wanting to show the manufacturer out, but the manufacturer said, "Chief clerk, there's something else I'd like to mention to you. I'm very sorry if it's something that'll be a burden to you today of all days, but I've been to see you twice already, lately, and each time I forgot all about it. If I delay it any longer, it might well lose its point altogether. That would be a pity, as I think what I've got to say does have some value." Before Kay had had the time to answer, the manufacturer came up close to him, tapped his knuckle lightly on his chest, and said quietly, "You've got a trial going on, haven't you?" Kay stepped back and immediately exclaimed, "That's what the deputy director's been telling you." "No, no," said the manufacturer. "How would the deputy director know about it?" "And what about you?" asked Kay, already in more control of himself. "I hear things about the court here and there," said the manufacturer, "and that even applies to what it is that I wanted to tell you about." "There are so many people who have connections with the court," said Kay, with lowered head, and he led the manufacturer over to his desk. They sat down where they had been before, and the manufacturer said, "I'm afraid